Norway Chess started today, featuring Carlsen, Anand, Aronian, Topalov and others. Very strong tournament indeed. And 3 out of the 5 games played today were decisive. I think the most interesting for me was the game between Hikaru Nakamura and Wang Hao. Nakamura had white. Let's see what happened. He played e4. I should say that Nakamura has a very poor record against Wang Hao, but they always have fascinating games. So it started out as a Petrov. Yes, even this game was fascinating with a Petrov. And Nakamura selected this knight c3 variation, which has become extremely popular over the last 10 or so years. The idea is that white is able to bring his pieces out very, very quickly. You can see that the lines are opened up for the bishop and this bishop here, but also for the queen. The queen can come out very quickly, whereas it's not so easy for black to bring out his pieces. You can see the bishop's blocked, and also the queen lacks a bit of freedom. So let's see how things develop. So this is all very standard indeed, black castles. Now the big idea is that white is going to castle queenside and white goes for it on the king side. Now the only problem is with this variation is that if white's initiative dries up, then he has nothing tangible in the position. You can see he has no real space advantage, for example, with his pawns. So that's why I don't play this variation with white. I think you have to play very accurately indeed to get the advantage. Nevertheless, it can be extremely dangerous. Now, 2 most common moves here are knight c6 and knight d7. But here Wang Hao selected b6. Now this is remarkably a new move in this position, but of course it's very logical to bring the bishop onto the long diagonal. And you can see that when white wants to start pushing pawns, it's not so easy with the bishop trained down here. But the bishop is excellent on the long diagonal, full stop. But Nakamura immediately put his finger on the problem with this move. So that once the bishop moves from c8, of course it was protecting the f5 square. On b7, the f5 square is weaker, so the knight moves in to this excellent attacking square. Kasparov always said that that's his favourite attacking piece, a knight on f5 when there's a king on g8. You can see it looms large around black's king side. So bishop f6, okay, that seems very sensible to bring the bishop out of the range of the knight. And now h4. Well, if you're going to advance your pawns on the king side, normally, you might want to play it against a pawn on g6 in order to open up a file. So, what is this pawn doing on h4? Well, we'll see, there are several uses for this pawn, actually. Okay, Wang Hao plays rook e8. By the way, at first I thought, well, maybe this knight could simply be pushed away with knight e7, but knight g3 is an annoying move, with the idea of simply coming to h5, hassling the bishop. And in that way, white keeps a bit of initiative. So anyway, rook e8, and now bishop g5. So we can see one of the reasons behind playing the pawn to h4. It supports the bishop coming here. And, well, of course, exchanging would be extremely risky, opening up the h-file. And if black doesn't exchange, then this bishop, well, it's rather irritating for black. Of course, black would like to play h6, and if the bishops are exchanged, then this brings black's queen to an excellent square and all problems solved. But the problem is that after h6, you can capture on h6. And here, instead of queen takes h6, rook h3 is a very nice winning move. So before capturing here, you make sure the rook comes into the game and there's absolutely no defense to the check. And then queen h6, and that will be mate. Black can play better, perhaps rook e5 and give the rook, and only then take on h6. But with rook and 2 pawns against 2 minor pieces, very pleasant for white. So Wang Hao played knight e5. Okay, opens up the bishop, gets the knight into play. Now this is a crunch moment in the game. Nakamura thought for 8.5 minutes here and came up with f4. This is a really uncompromising move because it compromises white's position. Positionally, it's very dubious because it weakens these squares on the e-file. But it sets up a really dangerous rolling initiative for white, as we'll see. So the knight goes to g4. You can see all these holes in the position. Also, weakens the long diagonal as well. But the point is this: suddenly, white's pieces flood out, and this is very uncomfortable. Of course, you wouldn't want to play c6, weakening the d6 pawn. But if you play rook f8, then white would seize control of the open file. Not so good. So Wang Hao played rook e4, and then the knight dropped back to g3. And this is really awkward. The bishop, the rook would like to keep on the e file, but can't return to e8. And in this position, a Chinese player thought for 24 minutes. Obviously felt very uncomfortable here, and he didn't come up with the best move. But it's already extremely tricky. For example, if rook e3, then knight h5. This is the really uncomfortable move, putting more pressure here. And well, I mean, maybe rook e7 is a decent move, but it's very hard to judge. I mean, white certainly has a really powerful initiative here. My computer actually recommends this and thinks that g6 is tenable for black, but in a game, would you really want to risk this kind of thing with the rook sort of dangling around the middle of the board? And well, maybe you can take this pawn, but white still has moves like bishop d3 and f5, and I'm not surprised that Wang Hao rejected rook e7. He played rook e6, and maybe he was anticipating knight h5 here. And in this case, I think this defense looks even better. Knight f6 certainly isn't possible here. The pawn just gets taken, and when the knight comes back, then knight e3, and white's initiative is well, it's not as strong as it was before. Black's gaining control, but I think this next move from Nakamura surprised Wang Hao. A really simple move. Instead of careering forward with knight h5, he's simply trying to take control of the e-file. Now the threat is, well, let's see, if you play h6, then you exchange on e6 and play queen e2, threatening knight and pawn, and that's already probably decisive, actually. So Wang Hao took, but now he's lost control of the e-file, and all white's pieces are active, and you can see that black still has a problem with his development. h6 from black. Now, it might be tempting to take the queen, but I think this would be a huge mistake. Well, Nakamura rejected this, because in this position, black is suddenly developed. He has a rook and bishop against the queen, and there are no real weaknesses in black's position. Black can set up a fortress here. After you exchange these knights, for example, and sit there, it's very difficult for white to make progress. So absolutely correct not to go for this. Instead, queen e2, much stronger move. Hitting the knight. Now, if pawn takes, then queen takes knight. And, well, let's look at another variation where white takes the queen. So you can see white's piece is really active here. And now there is a threat. Let's play rook e8 check and then knight f6. And if king f8, well, okay, now taking the queen looks much better, because black's king is weak. There's a passed h pawn, and that's probably too much for black to defend. Wang Hao played queen c8, defending the knight on g4. Now bishop d3 is a very strong move, threatening bishop f5. You can see how white's initiative just develops. It's just every move black is having to defend. And now, well, for example, pawn takes bishop, bishop f5. And this is just a tremendous initiative for white. Bishop d7 I really like, preventing rook e8, and then knight h5 or knight f5 are coming, and black's in massive trouble. So Wang Hao, short of time, just traded into a poor endgame. In some ways this might have been a disappointment to Nakamura. You know, he wanted to play an attack, but actually his technique from this moment was superb. So material is level, but this rook on e7 is just too strong. c7 is threatened, but also knight f5 and breaking through to g7. Knight d5 played, but this is well met by bishop c4 pinning. And here, if bishop takes, then this is such a simple win. White is just a pawn up. Knight f5 threatened. Black's pawn's terrible. Easy win for white. So instead, Wang Hao played king takes. They arrived at this endgame with two minor pieces against a rook. This should be a fairly simple technical win, so long as you don't allow the rook any activity. In that case, things aren't so simple, but actually, so long as white remains absolutely rock solid and just inches forward, slowly driving black backwards, should be a win. And Nakamura's technique was superb. Let's have a look. So first of all, the king comes into the middle. That's very important. Otherwise, the king could come in here, to f4, but then king e3 blocks the king out. Okay, the king comes forward, king e5. Now, white protects the f-pawn. That frees the knight on g3. So the knight just comes around to this superb square. Now h5, good move, just locking down the position, so no breaks with g6. So now he's ready to move the knight into e6. And the pawns are contained on the queen side. Now, black is almost in Zugzwang here. If the king retreats, then king e5 comes in and it's all over. And here, this is a nice move. If rook d6, this is actually Zugzwang. The king can't retreat, because then king e5 will win. And the rook can't move, actually. So this position is Zugzwang. For example, well, d4 can be played, but then, well, you just take the d-pawn and it's all over. So to block the bishop out, c4 was played. Now this could be taken, but it does allow a bit of counterplay with the rook coming in. But Nakamura played, I think, very elegantly. He didn't bother taking this pawn, and instead actually got another Zugzwang. In this position, actually after bishop f3 he resigned. I think, yeah, I think he resigned here. The point is this. Okay, again, if the king retreats, the white king comes in. If the rook moves this way, then bishop takes d5 wins. And if rook d6, then knight c7 wins the pawn on d5. Well, at least. If d4, then you actually have knight e8 check, winning the rook. So, yeah, I think a very careful finish there from Nakamura, and I think a very convincing game indeed. So, after the first round in Norway, Nakamura won. Svidler beat John Ludvig Hammer from Norway. Karyakin defeated Radyabov. His poor form continues. Carlsen drew with Topalov, and Anand drew with Aronian. There we go. Thanks for watching.